Ireland's non-fiction charts for 7 weeks and was named Biography of the Year at the 2022 Irish Book Awards. He has written for the New York Times, The Guardian, the Irish Times, and BBC Radio 4, and is currently working on several fiction and non-fiction projects. I'll now hand you over to Gillian. I hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Great, thanks very much, Brian. So welcome to everyone who's joined us today, and thank you very much for being here, Séamas. So I'm really thrilled to be talking with Séamas today. I knew him at a distance when we were both students together here in Trinity, and since I've followed his writing with absolute pleasure over the years. So not only this book, but also all the columns, the Twitter threads, the prank letters to newspapers, all of which we can hopefully get to chat about later. But let's start with the chart-topping, prize-winning, and generally fantastic memoir, Did You Hear Mammy Died? So Séamas, your book is many things. It's a story about piecing together memories of your mother and taking us through the aftermath of her tragic death when you were just 5. It's also a memoir of growing up as one of 11 children in Derry during the Troubles. And it's really a kind of love letter to your father, this incredible idiosyncratic man who brought you all up. There's a lot in there. So I want to start with the title. For anyone who hasn't yet read the book, it's a reference to you as a 5, almost 6-year-old, kind of cheerily and obliviously greeting visitors at your mother's wake by asking, "Did you hear Mammy died?" And as a title, it really sets the book up. It kind of already gives us a sense of the mix of pathos and humor that we're about to experience. And in particular, it also kind of announces, you know, this is a book about loss in many ways, but it's not going to be only a story of adversity and overcoming. It's not really in that kind of worthy misery memoir sort of tradition. So when did you decide that that was going to be the title? And how conscious were you of wanting to sort of distance yourself from other ways of telling this story or other models of memoir writing?
That's a really good question. The title was very early and my publishers did not like it. So I had to, it was one of my first battles where I wanted it to be, "Did you hear Mammy died?" And specifically, "Did ye hear Mammy died?" And not "Did you hear Mammy died?" as it was constantly being referred to even in that process. I think that what you said gets to the heart of it. I wanted it to be sort of common speech, and I wanted it to be arresting in the fact that it was clearly something which you could imagine coming from the point of view that I was writing the book from mostly, which was a child's obliviousness, something which is, you know, mildly shocking in, you know, the manner of, you know, children not understanding death and stuff. And also kind of arresting and perhaps having a bit of humor in it, but also having, you know, an Irish sensibility to it. I quite like the idea of just arresting someone who might expect, you know, something slightly weightier, especially because an awful lot of the books that I've loved and read that were about sort of some tragic topics, they didn't have an awful lot of humor, or they ran away from humor, and I don't really know how to write like that. So for me, it was very important that it kind of set out the stall early. I also just like the way it kind of sounds. It's scansion. I quite liked it. And I think if perhaps my publishers had their way, it would have been, you know, a Derry childhood, or I don't know why I'm making it sound like such hacks. They're very, very good at what they do. And in fairness, they just sent me one email saying they didn't like the title, and I said I like it, and that was it. So I'm not exactly, you know, kicking against the publishing establishment, but it was something which I had to convince them of, and then I think I was vindicated. But it did then cause some sort of slightly minor comments in the American release, because Mammy is very much associated, kind of a racial association there, which I was not aware of. In the back of my head somewhere possibly, but just didn't think that would come up. But no, the idea was from the outset to make it have that dual thing where, yeah, some sad stuff happened, but I also had a very happy childhood. Also, I was surrounded by extremely funny, strange people, and the sorts of things that happen to a child will affect them differently if they happen to an adult. And to a large extent, the book is written from that perspective. And that gives me a lot of leeway, not least leeway to make jokes, which is absolutely my number one priority, because it makes the whole process that little bit easier. It levens some of the sort of tougher material.
Yeah, so kind of staying on that sense of that particular perspective, or sort of that particular way of telling the story, there is a moment in the book where you kind of describe almost sort of an anti-model for how you really didn't want your family's story to be told. And this is when a tabloid magazine, I think it's Take a Break, covers your mother's loss, and your father's kind of raising this large family as, I think you say, it's a tawdry bit of sentimental fluff for people to tot along to and say how sad. And what I thought was really interesting here is that you then kind of say that that sort of approach removes every scintilla of complexity and nuance from a person's life. So I'm wondering if how did sort of dealing with those sort of mistellings of your story kind of condition the writing of this? And did you feel that adding those kind of comic and even surreal elements actually sort of made it more true to life, as well as everything else?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the thing I often say is it's not my sensibility to write in a very dour fashion, anyway. So that's not my skill set. So, you know, first things first, that's the reason why I speak and talk and think and write that way. But also, anytime that I've watched a play or a movie or read a book that dealt with, you know, someone's sad and tragic parts of their lives, and they don't leaven it with some of the funny stuff that happened along the way, or they don't throw in a joke or a strange person who did the wrong thing or a dog farting in the corner. You know, it's not just that it's not to my taste. It's like it's written by someone from Venus. You know, I don't know anyone who has had a life completely free of any humorous moments or strange absurdities, or where everyone, you know, acted like they were in a, you know, a black and white art film. That this is, to me, it's less true to life. And if in writing it, if I had any kind of restraint, it was almost having to force myself to sit with the sad stuff a bit more, because sometimes the corollary of all the stuff I just said is I probably run away from big emotions and from sadness because I can make a joke about it. And I think a lot of Irish families probably know that very weird contradiction where after, you know, the gap between tragedy and comedy is very, very small. So it's sometimes you get over things, or you get past things through laughing and through finding that sort of tiny little shred of sunlight that peeks in. And that's really good. That's extremely healthy. And I think it's a way of dealing with grief that is, you know, miraculous, that we have that instituted in our culture, and that wakes can be, you know, full of joy and singing and laughing, you know, as much as they're full of crying and sadness and whatever. So that's good. But the contradiction is that I think an awful lot of us, I'll speak for myself personally, possibly push down then the sadder bits once we get past those things. And so sitting with some of the real pain and the real sort of loss and stuff that I'd, you know, kind of spent a whole life trying to play down because it made people feel weird or awkward in polite conversation. It was easy for me to make jokes about my big family and, you know, to kind of poo-poo their kind of immediate horror-struck reaction on hearing, you know, when they first meet me, I have 10 brothers and sisters, but we were brought up by my dad because my mum died when I was very little. And then all of a sudden people go through that whole rigmarole of being, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, no, it's fine. Cue the jokes and everything else. And I realized when I was writing that I was doing that a bit too much on the page. So I did have to go through and kind of scrub them out. Because with the responsibility, and I do take it as a responsibility to be funny, comes the sort of corollary responsibility that you have to actually, you know, kill some of your darlings, remove some of the jokes, you know, to earn them, so to speak. So a lot of the editing process was, getting rid of really, really good gags and funny descriptions, because there is a balance there. So I had to earn them all. And I think I'm probably of all the parts of the book that I look back on and think, oh, I'm happy with that. It was that balance, because I didn't want it to be, psychopathically glib sort of comedy routine. Like, far be it from me to say that my mother's death was actually sad, and things like the take a break, or the the way that people used to talk to me as if I wasn't in the room about my mum's passing, on a more common note. Those did solidify for me the sort of thing I wanted to go against. That, sort of super modeling, super Hallmark Channel, sort of soft focus, tragic kind of thing. But the greater effort was then trying to find exactly the right balance. So yeah, that was very much the ordeal of writing the book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you really manage it. You do a really good job at kind of both taking that comic approach and using the comedy not only to kind of circle around the pain, but also to kind of bring us closer to that pain. And I think kind of literary sort of accounts of grief, or ways of accounting grief, there's often this sense, and just in general kind of social attitudes towards grief, there is often this sense that things either need to be made comic or need to be kind of told in this very sort of stoic way, that those kind of big messy feelings sort of have to be made palatable in some way. And yeah, you talk about a cultural sort of horror of fuss and drama and over emotionality. And one quote that I really thought was fascinating, you say, "The more I think and talk about the events of my life, the more I think on this horror of fuss, I consider it the part of myself and my homeland that I would like to change above all others." So yeah, I'm wondering, was the process of writing this one way of kind of starting to change that? Because you're talking here, of course, not only about the kind of personal trauma of your mother's death, but also the troubles in the north and kind of many different kinds of pain.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just wrote a piece recently for the Irish Times about the last few years. I've started speaking more, just not like at speaker's corner with a little with a little soapbox, but just generally with I live in London, so about the troubles, about those things, about certain aspects of my childhood that are very, very interesting, but which I never really had much opportunity to talk about, because that type of fuss I find when I was obviously at Trinity, so from 18 till 21, 22, and I was coming down at exactly a little blip in history where 18-year-olds who were from the Republic of Ireland or from further afield, there were not a lot of international students, they didn't have a clue what had gone on in Northern Ireland. Sometimes this was just sheer literal ignorance, like they just literally did not know anything. And sometimes it had calcified into sort of they didn't want to know. And it would dominate a discussion to a degree that they found maybe slightly unpalatable. So I learned quite quickly then not to talk about it. And I didn't talk about it with my Northern Irish friends, because what were we going to say? That we'd all had the same stories or worse stories. So it wasn't something that came up. We didn't sit around and talk about, Uncle Pat, getting into some trouble with the law, or, such and such a person, getting their house, blown up or something, because it was redundant. And it's only been, much later in life, I'm married to someone from Dublin, and occasionally, like literally 10 years into our relationship, I believe I told her for the first time that, like, the thing I talk about in the book, where the customs hut at the top of our garden was blown up by an IRA bomb, and a prefabricated wall fell into the garden with a sink still attached, like smolder. And I hadn't not told her this because, I wanted to save her dainty little Dublin sensibilities. It was because it just had never occurred to me, just forgotten basically that it was something worth talking about. And more as I get older, I realized there was a process there. There was a sort of a reluctance to make everything about you a reluctance to really think about it as this big, terrible thing that happened. I mean, I think I saw a really, really small microcosm of it during COVID, where every single thing that I said and every single thing that we were all going through that was, stressful or torturous, you'd always preface it with, well, of course, I don't have as bad as other people. Or, of course, it's nothing compared to you, or it's nothing compared to such and such. To some extent, that's a good impulse, not to put yourself at the center of the world. But also there's a point at which where you have to actually engage with these things. And, I think an awful lot of Northern Ireland is kind of in the throes of a form of PTSD, where I think I read once there's 115,000 people, probably less now, but this was in the early 2000s. So a lot of those people might have passed on. But there's 115,000 people who'd lost an immediate family member to the Troubles. So there are 3,500 people dead. Doesn't sound that much, if we can, ever say such a thing about actual human lives. But 3,500 people, it's not a super gargantuan number, but every single one of those people had a mother and a father, multiple siblings and cousins and everything. And that number doesn't even account for, your best friend, your work friend, your someone that you saw every single day down the shops, people who were a part of your community. And there hasn't really been a massive reckoning. There's obviously been political and legislative, and I think some sort of social reckonings. And we have enjoyed 25 years of relatively stable peace, for which we are grateful. But we also just kind of picked up and carried on. And I think that's strange. And a sort of microcosm of that again, I would say it was in my family, where we had the loss of my mum, tragically young. She was only 43. And as I get older and get closer to that age, it just becomes more and more blasphemous how young that is, because even as a kid, I said, oh, she died so young, because that's what everyone else said. I didn't think 43 was young. I thought 43 was, impossibly old. You're a full adult. And we obviously went through it. We obviously were lucky that we had such an amazing support of my dad, and also that he was, much more comfortable than other men, certainly, that I knew, in showing emotion and showing affection and talking these things through. That was a big part of why I think he did such an amazing job. But even still, there were limits. We all of us had our first experience of grief quite young and in quite a major way. And then we'd go away maybe to college or to work or wherever it was, and have secondary and tertiary kind of relapses into, sort of the grief of it. It wasn't possible to process it all at one time, especially not as a child. And I had that when I wrote the book. The whole premise of the book as I was writing it was, this is how I got through this thing, and this is, the people that helped me do that, and what it was like from the inside. And cheesiest thing author could ever say, but I realized I just had not gone through loads of it. There's parts of it that I find almost impossible to write, because I was like, oh, I've never said this, let alone written it for people to see, remembering things that were exquisitely painful, and also seeing myself as that little child, not as me, but as a child who's, I have a 5-year-old son, and he's creeping up to that age where he will be the same age that I was. And it's completely monstrous to imagine putting that on his shoulders. And so that's kind of the cruel, weird trick about grief, that it takes so long to settle through. But the only thing that makes it better is, actually working through it, not pressing it down. And that's as true in a personal context, I find, as it is on a sort of wider social context, where these things have to be talked about and fussed over. We should fuss over things, I think, where appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. Making a fuss is, I think, absolutely necessary sometimes. And I think kind of within sort of both of those themes also, one of the really nuanced parts of the book is the ways that you're kind of talking about the limitations, as you say, about speaking about them, partly because there's this sense that there are kind of hierarchies of grief and hierarchies of pain and who's suffered more. You know, when you speak about that explosion that you mentioned at the top of your road, you speak about it kind of getting shunted out of the news because there were other more impressive bombs, you say, with which it had to share its moment, which of course, you know, there's humor there, but it's also quite shocking. And yeah, I kind of wondered how that sense of whose story is this to tell, or what story you're telling, kind of was present as you were writing it. I think both in terms of your family story and of course the kind of wider context.
Yeah, that was really key. I should say as well, with a really, really pleasing symmetry. I believe there was it was literally one of 11 bombs that had gone off that weekend. So having 10 brothers and sisters, it was like, oh, this is too good. So even more callously, I jumped on that fact. Yeah, the who story it is to tell. The only responsibility I had, I suppose, at the first part of writing the book was that, because I'm not a psychopath. You know, I have to live with these people. You know, I love them, and I don't want to say anything that's, you know, going to really upset them, obviously. But I also knew that I was going to have to, because if I'm just talking about my 10 siblings and my dad, that's 11 people who, like, if any of them wrote a book which covered some aspect of my experience, there's no way they wouldn't say something that I find a bit off, or, you know, even with the best of intentions, it's a lot of people, a lot of differing understandings of things, and a lot of different experiences of things. I mean, we don't remember the same things. There are certain things which we all swear blind happen completely differently from the way that I do, or the way that my sister does, the way that my brother does. And I had to incorporate that into the text because, you know, it was the only way I could do it, because, you know, I had to say, look, the fact is, I don't remember saying this at Mammy's wake, the titular line, "Did you hear Mammy died?" But 3 of them did. 2 of them remembered me, like it was even worse. I was like jumping around and singing and, you know, dancing. And then the others don't remember it at all, or swear blind it probably didn't happen. You know, so you kind of have to work with what you have, and have your cake and eat it by mentioning that in the text as well. And when as I was writing it, I would send little bits and pieces. I mean, it's kind of where humor comes in very handy, because, well, for 2 reasons. One is I could always make myself the butt of the joke first and foremost, because, you know, if I'm writing this book, I should be, you know, spending my own cash. You know, I should be putting myself on the line. I should be making myself look as ridiculous as I am, and as childish and as, you know, idiotic as I am in some parts. And I think that then gives me license to, you know, attend the same thing. I don't think anyone is necessarily supposed to see me as a very reliable narrator in certain points, because I'm writing from the perspective of a child who is more concerned with getting attention than he is with decorum, or, you know, seeing things from other people's experiences. And also my family are all quite funny, so they don't mind being slagged off. And I think I was judicious in how I did it. So I described my sister Dervla as basically like a prison camp guard, for the way that she used to monitor our bedtimes. And she loved that, because I think she's still quite proud of it. She was like, "I'd do it all again." And she's like, I think sometimes, I mean, I got to read the whole book, or most of the book, to my dad before publication. So my dad's eyesight isn't great. He has diabetes, so he can't read text anymore. So he consumes all of his reading and everything from audiobooks. So I thought about 2 or 3 weeks before publication, I had the finished sort of proof, and I went home to Derry for 3 days, and I literally just, I think over 2 nights, sat him down. It was extremely awkward. I mean, you know, when you're at a party and someone gets the guitar out, and, you know, worse, they say it's one of their songs. Well, imagine that, but like the songs are all about your wife who died. So really, it demands way too much attention from the listener. It's, you know, I'm right there. He doesn't want to hurt my feelings, but also it's not a very natural experience. So we got some of the awkwardness out of the way very quickly, and pretty soon he was laughing and enjoying it. There was crying and everything. It was really lovely. And I could see the bits that I was skipping over as well. Either because I just thought, he wouldn't like them. My sense of humor is not identical to that of a 75-year-old man. But also just stuff that I thought that's a bit hard. Maybe that's something he wants to listen to on his own, or maybe that's something in which, I'm against time here. But the thing I really took away from it was the weight that was lifted once I did that. Because I had probably been more blasé about it, possibly as a protection technique in my own head. Is like, it's really, really hard to write a book. So you erect whatever lies and say, he'll be fine with it. It'll be fine. It'll all be good. I'm making the jokes. I'm the butt of the joke. It'll be fine. But then I was like, what if he hates this? What if this is offensive to him? This is his wife who died. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to him. And I'm here, popping off guns and being funny about it. But luckily that didn't happen. And he was very moved. And he said at the end that I was too good to him, which, I then offered to reread some of it again and say, well, I spend like an entire chapter describing you as God's one perfect miser. So, so you can't obviously please everyone. And I think there is a responsibility to run that risk, but I'm not nice guard. I'm not I'm not willing to just completely tear everyone apart in my life. So I did have to strike a balance there somewhere.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating kind of an unusual composition process, I think, with those circumstances. And yeah, one thing I kind of wanted to go to from there is, we think of memoirs, this very kind of personal, almost kind of individualist form. You're focusing on the teller's kind of very particular point of view and experience and feelings and that kind of thing. But both kind of in telling us about how the process of shaping it was for you, and also from the kind of the anecdotes and the stories from other people and in other people's voices that circulate through, you around the dinner table with your siblings, all of the people in the community who, and even in the hospital, who sort of stop you to tell you stories about your mum, and these memories that, as you say, you kind of have refracted and sort of pieced together only from other people's sort of reflections of them. I think there is a sense that it feels like quite a shared story or a kind of communal form in some ways. Does that sort of resonate with you?
No, it really does. And I'm really glad you find that, because one of the best things about having 10 brothers and sisters is it's like having 10 little sort of external hard drives. So at some points it was great. It was super great, because it was literally like, having an endless resource, and it almost always was. Like, as I say, we're very close as a family. There's 11 of us separated by 15 years. So as we all creak into sort of approaching middle age, we're basically the same age. The age range just means that we kind of get on very well. And also the fact that we have, been quite close, and probably were brought closer by, this earlier tragic event. And the way that my dad raised us to be very loving and everything else. But that being said, there's a million questions that I just never asked individual members of my family. Like, I might not have ever called Shane up at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday and said, what was Mummy's funeral like? Because it just wouldn't have occurred to me. But I did that. I now that I was writing a book, it was like I had a little trilby with, press sticking out of it. I had this amazing cover to go to anyone at any point, any time for the book, ring them up and say, to Shane on a random 4 p.m. On a work day, he's at his desk. I ring him up and I say, what was Mammy's funeral like? And he told me, and I'd never heard the story before. And then I just did the same with everyone else. And if anything ever occurred to me, we set up a little WhatsApp group that was just for their siblings. And it started off where I would say, when we were in Wexford that one time, and someone said, no, it was Waterford. And then someone else say, no, actually, I think that was actually in blah, blah, blah. That kind of stuff, real just minute problem solving. But from that would always come a million stories. From my brother, my brother told me that my sister cried so much at my mum's funeral that her shoe fell off. So I just couldn't work out the connection between the two things. Why would crying so much make her shoe fall off? And that's one of my favorite sort of visuals. It's not my own visual. I do not have a memory of that. It's something that after the 30 years of living through this, I'd still never heard that story. Or the fact that whenever I would ask anything, I would get so many responses back that were directly contradictory. So I was like, at the start, I was really frustrated by this, understandably. But I'm not a historiographer. And I was able to incorporate both. I was able to, as I say, have my cake and eat it and say, look, this is what this person says and this is what this person says. Like the phone call that came from my dad. My mum was in hospital in Belfast when she died. So my dad got the call at like 3 a.m. And he personally thinks that maybe she'd already passed by that point, but that's just his theory. So he got in the car, drove off, and at about 4 or 5, it takes 90 minutes to drive from Derry to Belfast. My dad did it in an hour. And he rang home, and one of my siblings picked up the phone and found out. And no one could remember who. Someone did. Some think it was Sinead, my oldest sibling. Some think it was Dara. Dara doesn't remember it. And you've got to imagine that is something you would remember. But then who knows? I don't remember being told. I remember things from maybe hours later. I think I remember my dad coming home. I certainly remember going up and hugging him and stuff. But these are huge, huge events. And yeah, I can remember my first taste of banana sandwich. Like, so I can remember random bus trips, looking out the window and seeing, and completely nondescript tree. I can picture them in my head. We all have that thing. So to some extent, having those 10 other hard drives is great, but they're also just as unreliable as mine. So sometimes it's like getting 10 cats to pose for a photograph. It's just completely impossible. And then sometimes, very, very rare times, it's like in a Bourne movie where you've got all those people in like a little office and they've all got satellite pictures and they all line up. But more often it was the other thing. I probably got more incredible detail from sort of people who were adults at the time. So my Auntie Patricia, who is not related to us, but in that my mum's best friend from childhood and from schooling and everything. She was incredible. She'd kept all these letters that Mammy had sent her, which were incredible. They're so humdrum and normal, they're just fascinating because they're so full of ordinary stuff. And then she'll have written a letter which is like four pages front and back, and like midway through the 3.5 page she'll say, oh, by the way, my cancer, it looks like it's back. And you're like, my God, she just spent all this time talking about what we were doing in school and checking in on people from back home and Enniskillen and all these other things. But she wasn't even then making a fuss. Even then, it was just something that she was getting through. So that really humanized her as a person. And I would never have had those little insights and those stories if it wasn't for people like Patricia and people like my Auntie Aileen, my mum's sister, who I'd never talked to as an adult about that stuff. But again, now that I was Séamas, the author, I was given license. So that was almost the best thing about writing the memoir, was I was able to embed within my own family. I was able to ask any question I'd ever wanted to ask or never thought to ask. And it had a reason. It had a justifiable reason. It didn't seem like I was prying. It didn't seem like I was dwelling. It was just for the book. And 95% of all the stuff I got never went near the book. But I have it now as information that I can use against them.
Yeah. The most important thing, for sure. I'm struck kind of as you're speaking here and also reading the book, kind of not only by what you say about sort of the fallibility of memory, but also the kind of power of memory also. I was really struck by the kind of sensory detail you were able to recreate, and even the memories of things like your dreams. So yeah, I guess first I wondered, you do mention in the book kind of at one point as a child writing down these 10 memories that you have of your mom. And Did you write when you were a child? Did you keep a diary? Or were these memories kind of kept alive more through, in a more kind of oral way, through talking and thinking about them?
Annoyingly, not stuff like that. I did in the book. I described that I wrote down 10 memories of my mum, and then I think within about a year, I only had 5. So you don't really know how many memories you have of someone until you're tasked with doing it. And annoyingly, I knew that I'd written 10, but I couldn't remember what they were. I just remember I'd been charged with doing so. And this was probably between the age of 7 and 8. So in that 1 year, I deleted half of my mum, effectively. That's how I felt as an 8-year-old. There was a lot of shame and grief in that. And in the course of writing the book, I uncovered 3 more memories in that very strange way that you don't. It's very weird when you get a memory that you just haven't thought about for a while. Because you're not recovering it. You've always known it. It's weird. It's like when you're trying to remember someone's name and then someone says it begins with J, and all of a sudden, yeah, it's John. You knew it was John. The whole time it's been John, but you just didn't have access. Some pathway was blocked. And that happened to me. So I was, if nothing else, writing this book gave me like a 60% increase in memories of my mum, which is pretty decent return, I think, even if no one had read it. But the thing about the memories that I put into the book, and the memories that I was looking for in the book, was some of them were just mundane. They weren't maybe the sort of thing that you would write down, except that they were of someone who had died. Whereas I have extremely detailed memories of things which were not nearly as important. And the things I used to write, I wrote an awful lot. So I'd write poems and do all the usual sort of like short stories for all the competitions and everything. Got a few medals, did quite well, quite pleased myself. And then, but it was never, I was a voracious reader, but I think I draw a line between those two things. I do so in the book, but I think the more I think about it, the more I can trace quite a clear line between I'm the guy that forgot about his mom, to being I'm the guy who will never forget anything, who will know everything, who will have all the facts, the perfect genius boy. So I was that annoying child that would follow the uncle around the party, giving dinosaur facts or quizzing them on the difference between evergreen and deciduous trees. Like I was basically a total nerd. And I think part of the reason for that, if I'm to be armchair psychiatrist, is a desperate willingness to know everything, to not forget things, to not let things pass me by. And my son, however, has not been bereaved of a parent, and he's exactly the same. So it could just be that we're just extremely annoying, precocious children. And I'm just trying to justify it with a sob story that gets me away with it.
That kind of, that real sort of hunger for knowledge that you describe, and kind of tracing sort of where it comes from, as well as everything else, it kind of really comes through in the book in terms of your very eclectic approach to watching movies from your dad's kind of giant archive collection, and also reading sort of based on what was available at home. And you sort of write with the same sort of fascination and enthusiasm about sports books and thrillers, your older sister's romance novels, and Thomas Pynchon, kind of whatever's there on the bookshelf. It seems like a very sort of natural and sort of curiosity-driven way of kind of reading. And I was sort of wondering, do you still read eclectically? Do you still kind of experience that curiosity?
Absolutely. In fact, I mean, in the book, the main reason for that was complete necessity. We were bored out of our minds. So we grew up way out in the sticks. So some people are from the middle of nowhere. We were from nowhere's most remote outskirts. There wasn't an Extravision or a Blockbuster or a cinema or anything nearby. There wasn't even a pub. The closest pub to our house is like a 45-50 minute walk away. And that's in effectively another country. It's in the Republic of Ireland. So the closest one in Derry is like a 2-hour walk. So we had to make do with what was there. And luckily what was there was my dad's extremely practical answer to this, which is he's an engineer. You know, he likes to build things and make things and that sort of stuff. So he built bookshelves in every room, and he just got, every time he went out, he'd come back with a book, and they were all, but it was the most ridiculous motley collection. Like I read like Gore Vidal, Live from Golgotha, when I was like 9 or 10, because it was the next book in sequence on that shelf that I hadn't read. So I went from like Roald Dahl and Enid Blyton, stuff that my dad had from the 50s, like old Eagle comics and sort of war annuals and stuff, to reading Live from Golgotha by Gore Vidal, which I say I read. I turned every page. I haven't a bloody clue what that was about. And I certainly didn't when I was 9. Jilly Cooper's Riders, and also Polo, which was my first ever experience of sex, of rich people as well, which has since become two of my favorite things. And so for me, it was eclectic, completely by necessity, and also because I was voracious. I enjoyed the fact that I was reading completely different things. I mean, I remember reading a leaflet that was about breastfeeding that my mum just must have had because of that, but I was reading it like it was a book, because I mean, I wasn't that smart, clearly, and I had no filter. I read my dad's books on like rose growing, you know, possibly not with as much interest, but as soon as I'd started, I had to go through that to finish it. And I would find something in there that was interesting. I'd find something, oh, that's a weird Latin name for a thing. And the same was true with the videos archive that my dad got. My dad is, he's more like me than I kind of give him credit for, because he's very into archiving, very into sort of technology and stuff like that, which I am. But also I think, you know, he was probably trying to make sense of a pretty insane, chaotic household, which would have been pretty insane and chaotic with 11 children, even if he did have his wife still going. But then if you add in all, you know, probably a lot of grief, probably a lot of unimaginable stress. I have 2 children, and every day I feel like there should be a parade for me. You know, it's so hard. You know, I should be getting a gleaming medal at the end of every single day. Poor me, poor me. My dad had 11 kids, and he would sometimes just go out to the office and he would work on some project. He'd be fixing some old radio. He'd be working on a sort of machine part. He's an engineer. Or he would be itemizing his entire collection of VHS tapes he recorded off the TV. I think we got to about 700. He then built a computer program, very early computer program. He was not trained in computers. He trained himself because he is that person. And in the early 90s, mid 80s, early 90s, he itemized every single one, printed out the brochure, and it was all in order of what had been recorded. So it was like, you know, number 1 was whatever the first thing he recorded was. We complained. The customer was not satisfied with this incredible thing that he just had. And he came back to us the next day with one that had, you opened it at the front and it was alphabetical. And then you opened it at the back, it was in order of things. So he was doing A/B testing with us even there. And what happened was the exact same thing. We didn't have a Blockbuster. We didn't really go to the cinema. We weren't near, you know, anything else. So we would go through this and we would just pick out movies based on, oh, Harrison Ford is in this. I liked him in this. And then that's how I watched all the Star Wars movies with all the ads from ITV from like the middle 80s. It's amazing, a sort of time capsule. But also films that I had no reason to be watching. We were obsessed with films that no one else had ever seen, but which in our house were blockbusters because we watched them every weekend. Grease 2 was clearly an improvement on the first Grease, obviously. And my dad's insistence on getting his money's worth out of his videos meant we had these insane double bills, which we watched through. So RoboCop was on the same tape, I think, as Pride and Prejudice. And I watched both films every time I wanted to watch either film. Or I believe Highlander was on the same tape as A Woman's Heart, live from RTE. So you'd have to be in a very specific mood to enjoy both of those cultural units at the same time. But we did. Like we did. There was one, probably the best. I'll end with this one, best one, which is the best, the worst, the best and worst take was Police Academy 4, followed by Police Academy 2. So 2 terrible films, out of sequence, and missing the middle film in the sequence. So yes, it's all completely random, and I have followed that now. I read extremely randomly. I've just this week been reading John Banville quite a bit, and I read the Book of Evidence, just finished it there this morning. and it's really, really annoyingly good. I mean, it's John Banville, so I should have presumed, but I just never read it. But the week before, I was reading a science fiction book set in Ireland, written by the guy who invented black hole theory. So yes, and I've got a big hardback book on druids that I've been working through. Because again, I'm just a giant child who sees a book in the shop and says, "I'm having that." I take it home, and then I get shouted at by my wife because there's nowhere to put our children.
It's a very freeing way to read. So I'm just going to ask one more quick question, and then we'll move over to the Q&A, if that's all right. So kind of, coming off that sense of the that sort of joyful randomness in the family, you also kind of talk about how 10 siblings means, more opportunities for mischief and mayhem kind of generally throughout. And you do a fantastic job at capturing that sense of childhood dibblement, the kind of creative bits of trickery of, tricking your dad into spending hours looking for tools in the garage. You had, I think it was a pot of 2p coins that you tricked your little brother into thinking were more valuable than £1 and that kind of thing. So I kind of wanted to bring up that spirit of sort of playfulness and play and mischievousness, because I think it's so important to this book, but it also seems kind of important to sort of you as a writer and your kind of development as a writer as well. And so I wondered, I'm kind of thinking here of your fake rush hour crush letters, and of course your viral thread of tweets about serving drinks to President Mary McAleese on ketamine. So yeah, I was wondering if you could kind of just tell us briefly before we move to the Q&A, the kind of role of play in these things and sort of how you started writing kind of through these sort of comic experiments.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely the impetus for everything. I think I was so taken as a kid by all the stuff that I'm describing, like reading so many different weird books. But the stuff that always just left me sort of reeling and flat were people who could write comedically and with play. The first time I encountered Flann O'Brien was like it was unbelievable. It was like a cold splash of water in the face. It's like, I could not believe that you could do this. So what everyone should take from this is that I consider myself exactly the same as Flann O'Brien. But I think that kind of play, or the old Monty Python annuals, I don't know if you ever read those, where they, things are coming in and off the page. There's footnotes which are commenting on things. That sort of like Viz comics, when I was a kid, the thing that really, really gripped me, that would have me, crying with enjoyment, was always humor that really, really kind of stretched and thought and seemed like it was, at a slight angle to the universe. And certainly Flann O'Brien was a big thing on that. And whenever I started doing sort of slightly more silly things, like sending in stupid letters to the Metro newspaper here in London, which is one of the first things that people noticed me for, that was completely informed by things like Viz or the Henry Root letters, or Robert Popper also has the Robin Cooper letters, where you're trying to do something very straight-facedly that's as stupid as possible, but without giving the joke away. And that's a very, very active mind of humor. And then I was lucky enough that I had some development in my past life, that just one day I decided I was going to tell the story of serving drinks to Mary McAleese. Well, I was on ketamine, by the way. Your phrasing might have suggested that she also was. To the best of my knowledge, that has not been the case. And the nice thing about that story was that so many people saw it that I basically owe the rest of my life to it, really. I quit my job about 4 months later, and I've been writing professionally ever since. Kind of got the book deal that I got because of it. Kind of. Definitely got the Observer. I mean, I was already an Irish Times columnist, so I wasn't completely, obscure and in rags, as some people think before that. But I'm so glad that it had the effect that it did, and I really like it as a story. It's still good. It still makes me laugh when I see it pop up every now and again. So laugh at your own jokes, guys. That's the secret.
So yeah, talking of writing secrets, you've led us quite nicely there onto the Q&A, where there's some fantastic questions, and there are several questions. I'll kind of match a few of them together, asking about any advice you have for aspiring authors, and also whether you have a writing routine yourself.
Oh, I love asking this question of authors, and I have a really, really bad answer, which is I have a terrible routine, which is that it changes all the time, simply because I have so many other things that I need to do. Generally, when I've been most successful, it has followed, it's been just getting up and doing it, limiting yourself to, or at least insisting on getting a certain amount of words every day. That's always worked for me. Having to say, I'm going to write 1,000 words. And even if they're absolute crap, and they often are, at least I've got that. And then you build up the thing and then you get edited down. But then that's not without its troubles. One thing that's really helped has been trying to, this is so boring, but it's true, moving, exercising, running. For me, I hate running. I hate it so much, but it's free and it gets my brain to work and to sort of roll over issues or something I've just written that doesn't make sense, or a story I'm trying to remember. And I hate that it works, but it works. So it might for other people. One thing that also I did, which I would recommend to absolutely everyone, would be when I was wrote the first draft. It was originally going to come out the year before, then COVID happened, and so basically it was a big delay. I took that like a hammer blow. I did not believe that this was due to anything other than the fact they'd read it and they thought it was crap. And I had all this thing in my head. So I was quite down, and as a result, I just put what I had in a drawer mentally and didn't look at it for 4 or 5 months. Now, this is very commonly given as advice, but I've never been able to do that because I'm so fastidious. I'm so neurotic that I'm constantly working away at something. But that distance was really, really useful. But the real thing that helped me, which is at least practical advice, which I recommend to anyone, when I then got that thing and I looked through it and I could see a few things I could change, I got the best results by literally setting up a podcast mic, connecting it to a little audio workstation, and I just read the entire book into a mic. I was on my own, and I was very, very, very specific about being on my own. I'd be very upset if anyone came into the room, which I didn't think, because I would get embarrassed. But I just read the whole thing. This is good for 2 reasons. One, as you read it, you will hear clunks, arrhythmia. You'll hear things which you've repeated. You'll hear things that just don't kind of fit, that are not necessary. You'll hear things that I've already said that, or this contradicts something I said over. If you are literally hearing it out loud from yourself and speaking out loud, you have an experience much more similar to that of the first time reader. And things aren't just glossing over your eyes because you've seen them on the page 1,000 times. And you're actually reading what's there on the page, not what you remember from the last draft, but you deleted this and you moved this. So that was really, really useful. And I would literally read it. And as I was reading it, say, no, that's crap. Pause the recording, change it back, put the recording back to the start of the sentence, and do the new version. And I did the entire book like that. So going through, changing whatever, until I had a recording and I had a text that matched it, which was maybe 20-30% different from the one when it started, because I changed so many tiny little things, and sometimes whole paragraphs, a whole chapter was lost doing that. And then I would put it on my phone and I listened to it when I went out on runs. And I heard, this is about 3 or 4 weeks later, I gave myself the gap. COVID was long and the lockdown was long, so I had all this time. And then I heard loads more problems, issues, corrections, things where I was just, why am I using so many adverbs? Why am I showing off? What am I trying to do here? Get back to the point. You've mentioned this thing, but then you never mention it again. All that boring stuff. But it was free, this process. It didn't actually require very much actual writing. It was just technical thought. And nobody does it. And so I recommend it to everyone, because if you're just in a doldrum with something, or if you've got something which you can't bear to look at anymore, and I have many of those things, sometimes it gives it a new lease of life, and sometimes it tells you, nah, you're right, it's not great, just start again, whatever it is. But you get distance and you get proper appeal. So that is a practical bit of advice, which doesn't even involve any actual real writing. It's just about perspective, distance, and buying a relatively decent quality audio mic.
Fantastic. That's great. I think our question askers have got their money's worth there in terms of really useful advice. So okay, let's squeeze in one more if we have time. Again, I'll sort of blend a couple together. So there are a few people in the Q&A asking about kind of future work and future plans. The people want more Séamas, essentially, is the message I'm getting. So someone's asking about a potential screen adaptation of your memoir that's been rumored. And someone else is asking whether you would consider writing a novel of fiction.
I might currently be doing that, but I never really know quite what I'm allowed to say in these situations. But yes, I am writing fiction at the moment. It's really, really hard. The entire time I was writing a memoir, I was like, it'd be so much easier if we could just make this up. And I now realize that is exactly arseways. Because now I'm writing fiction, and I just think several times a day, it would be really, really handy if I could just remember things and add jokes. So yes, I find I'm really enjoying it. It's a process which hopefully will be announceable soon. With regard to screen adaptation of the book, yes, there are things kind of in the works, but it's just one of those things where until there's a green light, we're really, really happy with what we have, if I can say that. I'm very, very happy with, the talent that's attached and the people that we've been working with. But these things, man, it is a torturous process that goes through so many, hoops. And it's been a real eye opener, but it's been really, really, really fascinating. And as soon as there is actually something to talk about, I will be able to stop. So this is a brief period of silence until, if and when that should happen. Hopefully I'll be a bit more profligate with it.
Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, I think we have run out of time, so we should wrap up there. Thank you so much, Séamas. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you so much to everyone who's tuned in and joined us and asked such brilliant questions, which unfortunately there are lots that we didn't get to. So I'll pass back over to Brian then to close up.
Thank you so much, Gillian.
Thank you, Gillian, for leading such an entertaining discussion. And thanks as well to Séamas for thoughts and insights on your acclaimed work. We are grateful to you both for being so generous with your time and for sharing your expertise. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the Alumni Office for making today's webinar possible. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of you who are joining us today and asking questions. It's always fantastic to have that engagement and enthusiasm. I'm going to share my screen now again and tell you about upcoming activities. The Inspiring Reads at Trinity will be taking a break for the summer, but we'll be back later this year and look forward to bringing you more webinars responding to the titles of our book club members that they'll be reading. And these upcoming episodes will feature insights from authors, publishers, and academics. If you would like to join the Trinity Alumni Book Club, please email the Alumni Office at alumni@tcd.ie. You can also find details on our website, tcd.ie/alumni/community/book club, or scan the QR code that's on your screen now. Thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you again later this year. Until then, take care and have a lovely summer.